A single bomb fell on Gruinard Island in 1942, and the British government erased the place from public existence for the next 44 years. No warning signs were posted for the nearby mainland communities. No explanation was given. One day, the island was a quiet grazing ground off the northwest coast of Scotland. The next, it was the most contaminated place in the Western world. But the story of Gruinard is not simply about one weapons test on a remote Scottish island. It is about what happens when a government decides that national security permits the poisoning of its own land and the silencing of its own people. The farmers who watched their sheep die on the mainland shores were not offered answers. They were offered money and a signature line beneath the Official Secrets Act. And what was buried alongside those dead animals would not surface for nearly 5 decades. The roots of Gruinard stretch back to Porton Down, the military research facility in Wiltshire that had been studying chemical weapons since the First World War. By the late 1930s, with war looming again across Europe, a small group of scientists inside the biology department Porton began asking a different question. Not gas, not mustard, something biological, something that could kill on an industrial scale and leave buildings standing. The man at the center of this work was Paul Fildes, a distinguished microbiologist who had spent years studying bacterial infection. Fildes was recruited to lead what became known as the biology department Porton, a gruesome little unit tasked with determining whether biological agents could function as weapons of war. His conclusion came quickly. Anthrax, specifically Bacillus anthracis in spore form, was the ideal candidate. It was lethal when inhaled, it was easy to produce, and its spores could survive in soil for decades, perhaps centuries. The organism was, in Fildes' own assessment, the most practical biological weapon available to the British Empire. What Fildes needed was a testing ground, somewhere remote, somewhere expendable. Gruinard Island sits in Gruinard Bay between Gairloch and Ullapool, barely 2 kilometers long. In 1942, it was uninhabited, covered in heather and peat, owned by a family that had no idea what was coming. The military requisitioned the island under wartime emergency powers. No public record was made. That summer, a team from Porton Down transported anthrax bombs to the island. They tethered sheep at measured distances from the detonation points and dropped the devices from a low-flying bomber. The sheep began dying within days. Film crews documented the results. The tests confirmed exactly what Fildes had predicted. Aerosolized anthrax spores dispersed efficiently, infected rapidly, and killed with near-total reliability. 80 sheep died in agony across multiple trials. But the deaths that truly haunted the local population were not on the island itself. They were on the mainland. Within weeks of the first Gruinard tests, carcasses began washing ashore on the Scottish mainland near the bay. Livestock on coastal farms started dying of anthrax. Farmers who had grazed cattle and sheep on those pastures for generations found their animals collapsing with blackened, swollen organs. The government's response was swift, but not in the way the farmers expected. There was no public health announcement, no admission that weapons testing had contaminated the coastline. Instead, officials arrived quietly. Farmers were told their animals had died of a natural outbreak. They were compensated with payments made on the strict condition of silence. Those who pressed for answers were reminded of their obligations under the Official Secrets Act. The message was unmistakable. Take the money, say nothing, and the consequences of disobedience, well, those went unspoken but understood. Local veterinarians who examined the dead livestock knew something was wrong with the official story. Natural anthrax outbreaks do not appear suddenly along a coastline facing a military-restricted island. But the wartime apparatus of secrecy held firm. The farmers buried their animals, they cashed their checks, and they kept quiet. After the war ended, Gruinard Island simply ceased to exist in official conversation. The government posted small warning signs, landing prohibited, but offered no explanation of what had happened there. For the general public, the island was just another patch of empty Scottish rock. The wartime biological weapons program was folded into classified archives, and Porton Down continued its work behind closed doors. For nearly 4 decades, Gruinard sat untouched. The anthrax spores burrowed into the topsoil, forming a persistent reservoir of contamination that showed no signs of degrading. Scientists who quietly monitored the site found viable spores year after year, decade after decade. The island had become a permanent biological hazard, and nobody in government seemed interested in doing anything about it. Local communities along Gruinard Bay lived in the shadow of the island. Parents warned children away from the shore. Fishermen gave it a wide berth. Everyone knew the island was dangerous. Almost no one knew exactly why. The silence broke in 1981, and it broke violently. A group calling itself Dark Harvest delivered a sealed package to the Conservative Party conference in Blackpool. Inside was soil, contaminated soil taken from Gruinard Island, still harboring live anthrax spores, 40 years after the original tests. A second sample was left outside Porton Down itself. The action was claimed by activists connected to Scottish nationalist and environmental groups, though the exact membership of Dark Harvest was never fully confirmed. Their message was blunt. The British government had poisoned Scottish land, lied about it for decades, and abandoned any responsibility for cleanup. The proof was in the package. The stunt forced the government's hand. For the first time, officials publicly acknowledged that Gruinard Island had been used for biological weapons testing during the war. The admission was grudging, defensive, stripped of detail, but the door had been opened, and it could not be closed again. In 1986, the Ministry of Defense finally began decontaminating Gruinard Island. The method was brutal in its simplicity. Workers sprayed 280 tons of formaldehyde solution, diluted in 2,000 tons of seawater, across the most contaminated areas. The topsoil was stripped in sections. The entire island was soaked in chemical disinfectant. The operation took several years. Monitoring teams returned repeatedly to test soil samples for surviving spores. In April 1990, the government declared Gruinard safe. A junior defense minister, Michael Neubert, visited the island and symbolically removed the warning signs. The land was returned to the heirs of the original owners for the reported sum of £500, the same family from whom it had been requisitioned nearly half a century earlier. Whether Gruinard is truly safe remains a matter of quiet scientific debate. Anthrax spores are among the hardiest biological structures known. They resist heat, desiccation, ultraviolet radiation, and chemical treatment. Some microbiologists have expressed doubt that any surface decontamination could eliminate every spore from an island that was systematically saturated with them. The government says the island is clean. Not everyone who studies Bacillus anthracis agrees. Gruinard Island is green again. The heather has returned. Seabirds nest along its cliffs. From a passing boat, it looks like any other small island on Scotland's Atlantic coast. Nothing about its appearance suggests what happened there. But the story of Gruinard is not really about an island. It is about the machinery of secrecy that allowed a government to contaminate its own territory, poison the livestock of its own citizens, and then bury the entire episode behind classification stamps and legal threats for more than 40 years. The farmers along Gruinard Bay were not enemies of the state. They were sheep farmers who lost their animals to a weapons program they never knew existed, and they were told to be grateful for the compensation. Paul Fildes went on to receive a knighthood. Porton Down continued its research. The Official Secrets Act remained in force, and Gruinard sat there, quietly lethal, while the government waited for people to stop asking questions. They almost did. Almost. It took activists mailing contaminated soil to a political conference before anyone in power acknowledged what every farmer in Gruinard Bay had known for decades. The island was poisoned, the government did it, and the silence was never about protecting the public. It was about protecting the institution that made the decision in the first place. Some contaminations wash away with time and formaldehyde, others settle deeper into the relationship between a government and the people it claims to serve. Gruinard Island may be green again, but the precedent it set that a state can poison land, silence witnesses, and wait out the clock that has never been decontaminated at all.